Hello and welcome to the Two Mats podcast this Monday evening.
Welcome.
We are joined, very glad to be joined by Damian Collins. Damian, welcome.
Thank you. Damian.
Damian was Conservative UK Minister for Tech and Digital Economy and chair of the DCMS, Digital Media, Culture and Sport Select Committee. You chaired the joint committee of the UK Parliament, which led the scrutiny of the Online Safety Bill, which passed into law in 2023 and is going to be enacted this year, I think.
Operationally live in March.
In March,
yeah.
right. And that is a massive topic we want to talk about. You lost your seat in the general election last year. You have the ignominy of being the first Tory to lose Folkestone in, 70 years?
More than that. certainly since the popular franchise.
And you're also an author of a brilliant book about David Lloyd George called Rivals in the Storm, which we're going to talk about in the second or third,
probably the third
bit of this podcast. I also noted that you're on the board. Are you still on the board of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which is relevant to this conversation because it's currently, ironically, being sued by Elon Musk, isn't it, for writing nasty things about it.
Yeah, well, they won. They defeated him in court in California.
Brilliant. So that's over. The reason that passed me by completely, but I noticed the irony of ironies is that their Twitter account has been suspended by Elon Musk. The absolute
free speech, absolutely.
Anyway, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Pleasure.
So, Damian, it's great to see you again because I sort of feel we've been having a discussion about social media for quite a long time, and you were always the person in Parliament, I thought, who really understood what was at stake, and along with a few others, some journalists, some think tank people, kind of really was the spear's tip, as it were, in trying to get something done about it, which was, I think, sometimes, perhaps I'm speaking out of turn, but I think it was sometimes quite lonely work in that not everyone in Parliament was perhaps as careful about looking into the full impact of this. But I want to let's start at now, and then we can look back at how we got here. You write a very good newsletter about tech, and you've been writing about what has been going on in the last few weeks, amongst which has been Mark Zuckerberg's big shift at Meta on fact-checking and so on, and also something we've had cause to comment upon, Zuckerberg's obvious desire to use the full power of the federal government and diplomacy and force and tariffs to leverage his and other companies' interests overseas. And I noted that he regards the many billions of fines that have been levied by the EU against tech giants, as he describes them, Zuckerberg does, as a tariff, which is ridiculous, but it gives you a sense, I suspect, of how some of the bits fit into this administration. So tell us give us a horizon view of how you think the tech bros and Trump and MAGA all fit together.
Well, if you go back to 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected, and the aftermath there was a start of what some of the people in tech now see as a challenge to big tech over trust and safety. I think what we saw then in the 8 years that followed was executives like Mark Zuckerberg, aided by people like Nick Clegg, going around the world saying, no, we get it, we understand, we've got high standards, we don't want bad user experiences, we don't want Russian disinformation and hate speech on our platform. And then the debate was, in some ways, we don't think you're doing enough to do it. All the independent research suggests your systems aren't anywhere near good enough, and you should be held responsible for them because you designed them to make money for yourself. What we're seeing now is almost the end of that debate, not because we as legislators, or I don't believe the public, don't think it's important anymore, but because the tech companies themselves have decided that it's not. And they've decided that it's not, in the hallowed sanctuaries of Mar-a-Lago, talking to Donald Trump, where alongside conversations about campaign finance, there has been this movement which is really a pushback against trust and safety. That started with Elon Musk and now very much includes Mark Zuckerberg, where the companies...
Trust and safety, I suppose we should define It means moderation, standards, and so on, doesn't it?
Indeed, yeah. So there are community standards that the platforms set to make sure people have positive user experiences, and you see less of the hate and division that has become so much a feature of people's experience on social media. Better child safety, less of the promotion of things like self-harm and suicide to teenagers and so on. What we've seen now is a pushback from the companies on that, saying in America they feel that that's gone too far, that they felt pressured into removing content they should never have removed, that they want to stop doing that. The fact Mark Zuckerberg says they're going to get rid of fact checkers. But actually more important than that was the kind of headline grabbing bit. More important of that is the way they regulate the recommendation tools on the platform, which will favour what they call civic groups, which are the sorts of informal friends.
A euphemism if ever there was one.
Yeah, indeed, because they're the least uncivil places on the whole you could imagine. And they are really the sort of place where disinformation, conspiracy theories and hate speech really is ramped up and spreads massively. So they're saying we're going to favour that higher than we do trusted news sources. So the sorts of problems we've been talking about in the past will get a lot worse as a consequence of that. So the companies are saying, well, we don't like this regulation. We were basically made to do it and we shouldn't have done it. The new president's saying we don't have to do it anymore, so we're not going to. And more than that, we want the American government to be pressurizing other governments around the world that have legislated, have created laws to set safety standards, that we want them, the American government's pressure to try and undo that work as well. So we're seeing, I think, something new that's springing out now, which is almost an activist tech sector, where its leaders are really saying we should operate by our own standards and outside of local laws around the world. We should be able to do what we want within our own wall garden.
I mean, when you were chairing the select committee and then also squiring the online safety bill through, I remember you were, quite concerned about the sort of aggregation of power in the tech companies. But I wonder, Damian, could you have ever foreseen something like Elon Musk's ascendancy? I mean, just for example, he's been found out, but thanks to good reporting, to have just basically sent some of his guys from the DOG, Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a department, into the Treasury, the US Treasury, to get completely unlawful access to the classified federal payment system. Now, this is, it's melodramatic to call it a coup, but it is a private citizen obtaining access to highly, highly sensitive data with complete impunity. Did you ever think that would happen, that kind of thing?
No, I think you'd always thought the checks and balances would be there to at least stop that kind of direct access. The concern was that these companies would find ways around. They'd find other ways of getting access to that information or inferring from data to create it for themselves, but not that they could just go and grab it whenever they wanted.
But this is overt, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And what we're seeing, I mean, I think Elon Musk claims to be an advocate of free speech. He doesn't run a free speech platform.
Right.
What he really runs is a broadcasting platform where the content is dialed up to reflect him. I mean, I've not left it because I don't want to abandon at least having a voice there, no matter how small it is. But the user experience now is it's content recommended by him, largely content you don't follow by people you don't like being pushed at you, far less friends and family stuff, far less of the community stuff you used to see. And if you are a voice that challenges his, then you really get very little coverage at all. Yeah. And worse than that, they actively go after people they think are challenging them and are seeking to, criticize them or challenge them and their business model in any way. And what this is a process of shutting down dissent. And if you look at any totalitarian regime of the past, then one of the first things that is suppressed is the alternative voice.
Yes.
And I think that is what we're seeing people like Elon Musk trying to do on platforms like X.
Ironically, under the guise of doing precisely the opposite.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
I mentioned on another pod, Andy Murray tweeted the other day saying he'd just woken up and 15 of the top 17 tweets on his timeline were all from Elon Musk. He said, some algorithm you've created, mate.
Yeah.
So can you take us back to, was it, when did the online safety bill start going through Parliament? Was that 2016 or later?
I would say, so we, when I was chair of the select committee, we started an inquiry in 2017, late 2017. Yeah. That was called Disinformation and Fake News. And what it was, it started off looking at the prevalence of disinformation on social media platforms. There have been some analysis around the 2016 presidential election that showed that the biggest fake news stories had a bigger audience on Facebook than the biggest real news stories had done. This was the sort of Pizzagate type stories.
Yeah.
That, and I mean, now seem quite wild conspiracy theories, but nevertheless, this was kind of interesting that people found it difficult to distinguish between the two, and social media was the distributor of it. We started looking at that. We were sort of looking at it when what became known as the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke. And that was really about how these sorts of stories spread, not just organically, but through data profiling of users. Content was pushed at people that were likely to be receptive to it.
Micro-targeting that's almost impossible to trace.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But more than that, not just micro-targeting by external actors, but that actually the recommendation tools of the platforms worked in such a way that if they could see there was a preference for, and it could be conspiracy theories or disinformation from a certain user group, then they saw more of it. It was actively recommended to hold people's attention. And what we concluded in our report, which was produced in 2 stages in 2018 and January 2019, was that what we needed to have was a system where the platforms were legally accountable for what they did.
Yeah.
That there was an independent regulator that had oversight of it, and that regulator had the power to have access to data and information within the companies to see whether they were doing what they should be doing or what they said they would do.
And let me just ask you there, when you say the platforms are legally accountable, you're talking about them as corporate entities, aren't you? You're not talking about Zuckerberg as an individual, for instance.
Yeah, the corporate entity. I mean, and the reason that is significant is in America that's not the case.
Yeah.
In America, they have a carve-out in legislation, something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which you'll often hear. If you often hear people randomly referring to something called Section 230, that's what they're talking about. It's the protection from liability the companies have. And so in America, you've got these American companies who are used to 2 things. One, this carve out from legal liability. And second, the very loose interpretation of what the First Amendment means in America, which, and there are even in America limits on free speech. You can't use your free speech to incite racial hatred that leads to physical violence against an individual.
And the First Amendment only refers to government.
Indeed.
So although the culture of the First Amendment is very prevalent,
Yeah.
it's often invoked in a rather specious way, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so and in America too, there are movements even amongst conservatives in America for there to be more liabilities for the platforms to combat things like, certainly child safety standards, fraud, and obviously terror-related content. So you had a cultural clash with the big American companies over that. But what we did here, I think we started that process of really identifying what we thought the problem was and what the solution needed to be, of kind of liability and accountability, transparency being the kind of 3 things that we needed. That then became the government's, that really, I think, helped inform the government's internet safety strategy. And the online safety bill emerged out of that. But you're looking at what was really a kind of almost 6-year process to create that legislation.
And honestly speaking, we're a small island. America is increasingly calling the global culture shots now. Is that a fair reflection? How can we stand up to these huge megalithic corporations who are just riding roughshod over what I think any decent person would say? It's obvious that there should be some kind of restraint on suicidal content, on self-harm, on incitement to violence. And you've got a guy, the leader, the most influential man on the planet when it comes to that, saying, nah, don't think so.
Well, I think that's where you've got to be careful how you frame the debate. And what we were very keen on doing with the Online Safety Act was really making it about the enforcement of existing laws.
Right.
Because I think you list those offences in law, and most people would say, well, yeah, of course, you should include that. But what we shouldn't have is legislation that is giving arbitrary rulings or criminalising political speech. And that's quite right. We shouldn't have that, and we don't have that. We should be clear about what it is we're trying to achieve. I think the fact that people like Mark Zuckerberg are now speaking out saying the American government's got to get tough with other governments around the world who've passed these laws we don't like, that shows you that it's worked. It shows you that they've taken notice of it enough for it to be a concern for them enough that they've spoken out in that way, that they know they've got to comply. The EU has done it. The UK has done it. Canada was in the process of tabling and looking to pass an online safety bill. That's now really come to an end because of the the sort of political changes in Canada that are going on at the moment. In Australia, you've seen the government there has created its own e-safety regime, slightly different to the Online Safety Act, but nevertheless a robust and sensible piece of work, and now looking to go further in banning under 16s from social media. So governments are doing that. I was at a conference in Germany recently, and again, we were talking about President Trump's speech to the delegates at Davos, where he more or less said that misinformation and disinformation, the era of defining that is at an end. Well, what does that mean if you're a German, where in Germany Holocaust denial is an offence in law? It's not elsewhere. Does that mean that the Holocaust is a matter of opinion?
Yeah.
Does that mean if the balance of opinion on one platform is that it didn't happen, then therefore that can be the prevailing view? And even on some of these harder political questions, we've got to take a stand for protecting our culture, our history, our traditions, based on the facts and interpretation of history that we share.
Do your political antennae, Damian, tell you that Trump will oblige Zuckerberg and use tariff pressure, diplomatic pressure to make, say, the UK and EU countries tone down their regulation? I mean, do you think there'll be follow through on that, or is it not high on Trump's agenda, in fact?
I think he will probably let them down. The reason I think that is that I don't think the EU is going to budge on this. If there was a tariff war between America and the EU, that's not just going to be about digital regulation. There'll be a whole range of things.
Yeah.
We found with UK-US trade agreement, last time Donald Trump was president, it didn't really go anywhere. Again, because there's a whole wide range of complex issues to be resolved and no great urgency to resolve them.
Chlorinated chicken is more important.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's
hate speech.
But digital regulation was part of it. I was tipped off about this by an American senator who said you should be aware that the UK-US trade agreement is very similar to the one that the Canadians have agreed, and that baked in accepting American tech regulation for American companies as part of the agreement. Now, I raised this in Parliament in 2020 to the then Trade Minister Liz Truss to say, would she guarantee we would never accept a trade agreement which would compromise our ability to legislate on online safety, which she said we wouldn't do. And indeed we didn't, that went nowhere. But what we've got to assume is this is coming back. What we have to be vigilant for is not a full-scale retreat, but that the government doesn't accept at the margins what externally may seem like minor reforms, but which can make in practice implementing this legislation the way we want very difficult. So I think we've got to be prepared to stand firm and fight for the progress that we made.
Why is the Act, which became law in 2023, taken so long to be ready to implement? You mentioned just before it's March that it comes into full practice. Why the gap?
Well, it took a long time to get through Parliament, and that was couple of reasons, one of which I ended up being a part of. It went through a process of pre-legislative scrutiny by a joint committee of both houses. It's not a typical process that we go through. It tends to happen for major bills that are on fairly novel areas of law, and actually was a really good process because it means a committee of both houses can go through it line by line and really identify the sorts of issues that are often debated on later. In a lengthy report, the government accepted 70 recommendations we made as a committee to amend the bill. So that process of scrutiny and then consideration and amendment took a bit of time. But that meant, I think, the bill had a much smoother passage through Parliament when it landed. We then had 2 changes of Prime Minister. So it got not many government bills where the Prime Minister has been 3 different people during the passage of that bill. What's interesting, though, is that with Boris Johnson being followed then by Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and, Matt, you'll know from your time in Whitehall as covering the political beat that, changes of number 10, changes of personnel, changes of political staff are often quite difficult periods for governments. They create a lot of change.
The weather changes.
But the fact this bill survived through that process, I think, shows the amount of political consensus that had been established around it and that it went through. And I think it ended up was a longer process than we would have wanted. But I think we may have ended up, even though we wouldn't have designed that process as it ended up being, with a better piece of legislation as a consequence.
Jamie, ask one on the back of that? What were the sort of the thorniest ambiguities that you wrestled with in that joint committee then, as you were going through the legislation? Give us a sense of the kind of difficulties where people may think, well, it's black and white, but actually it's very, very grey.
So the hardest area is where you're. Is I think where do you have, and in some ways this is what the European legislation is like. Do you say on the companies they have a general duty of care to do the right thing, enforce their terms and conditions, deal with the worst kinds of illegal activity, or do you say specifically, okay, we're going to regulate you on whether you do these certain things? A lot of people favour the duty of care model because it's more of a catch-all. But if it's not clearly defined, it can be difficult to enforce.
Yeah.
Now, what we shifted to do in the Online Safety Act was to say actually what we're going to enforce are what we call priority illegal offences written on the face of the bill. So these are the acts in law, like inciting racial hatred, harassment, immigration offences, offences for under the National Security Act for foreign state interference and so on. These are laws we've established. We know what the legal thresholds for them are. The regulatory standards can be based on our laws. And then in addition to that, we'll regulate you based on what you say in your terms of service you'll do. So what it says on the tin,
right.
We will expect you to deliver.
Right.
And then it's down to you. Now, the tension is always then, well, does that catch everything? And that's where you've got to weigh up this tension to say, if we can't in law define what it is, then how can we expect a company to take proactive enforcement action on that content when it's not clear?
Yeah.
And the tension with this will always be that level of definition. Can you be absolutely certain? But I think it needs it. Otherwise, I think what you'll end up with, where you've got looser definitions, you'll find it harder to enforce. And you've got a recipe for lengthy litigation where you argue whether it was clear enough what you wanted. What we've got, which the EU hasn't got as well, is then a national regulator enforcing codes of practice. And what the codes of practice do is the regulator goes to the company in advance and says, here are the safety risks we've identified on your platform. You explain to us how you're going to meet those risks, and we will regulate you based on whether you do that or not. And if they won't comply, then the regulator can say, well, this is what we think you should do, and we'll take action on that. But it's much clearer to everyone what you should be doing. I think this is going to be easier to work with. But the tension is there around, are you encroaching into areas of free speech?
Yeah.
We can't legislate to make sure no one's ever upset by what they see online. But what I think we can do is to make sure that a teenage girl is not relentlessly targeted with self-harm images, walking her by the hand from depression towards suicide. I think, and that's I think that we have to be really clear about what it is we expect the companies to do.
Because we'll talk about the current status of the Conservative Party and Kemi Badenoch in the next part. Kemi Badenoch did react to some of the proposals by saying we shouldn't be legislating for hurt feelings.
Yeah.
And you slapped her down on Twitter and said,
We're not.
What is it? Do you get that sense of it, besides it being a technical challenge to say this is where we're going to regulate, this isn't where we're going to regulate. It's also a cultural challenge that there are forces within your own party, forces at large, who are more inclined towards Musk's sentiment than they are towards what our sort of decency sentiment, if you like.
But then I think the way we constructed the Online Safety Act is what you might say in response is, well, here's the list of the priority illegal offences we've included. Which ones do you want to take out? Because on the whole, that then becomes quite hard.
Yeah.
And you found with people who might be saying we don't want to legislate for hurt feelings, people might say, well, what about I'm really concerned about race hate, or I'm really concerned about anti-Semitism online. Where are the enforcement standards on that? If you start watering all this down, all that goes as well. And that's why I think it's better to have a regime based on clear definitions where people know, and those definitions ultimately are linked back to what our laws say, laws Parliament has passed. And the challenge for Parliament in the future then is to say, well, if you think there are things that aren't in scope that should be, can you define what they are and pass an amendment which will include that? But I think people, like Kemi, who were concerned that there might be, that we were trying to regulate on, what people consider to be harm. The word harm is the sort of, if you're saying we're going to get rid of harmful speech, well, what's the threshold for harm? How is that defined? Now, the Law Commission can define it for you in a very legalistic way, which is like extreme psychological harm, where someone has been deliberately targeted with a view of causing distress. What it can't be is someone saying, well, that opinion I find so harmful that it makes me want to hurt myself. You've got to have a degree of definition there. Yeah. The challenge, I think, for the platforms is to make sure that it's the prevalence of the regulated content as well. The things we want to take responsibility for. If you can dig around and find something bad somewhere, yes, there is harm, but it's a relatively small number of people are being exposed to it, the higher level of responsibility for them is to make sure they're not, as they have done in the past, actively amplifying and promoting harmful content. And there are studies that show that the spread of a lot of the worst kind of extremist content is done at the active recommendation of the platforms themselves. They're recommending people join groups of neo-Nazis and so forth online. The systems they've built are being used to facilitate crimes against people, in certainly other parts of the world where that is prevalent, hate crimes being committed by the Rohingya community in Myanmar, facilitated by Facebook groups. That kind of the worst kind of behaviour and content. We should expect a much higher level of compliance from the companies.
Was there ever a debate about a separate regulator rather than including this under the existing quite large remit of Ofcom?
Yes, and the question there is, do you have an internet regulator? And the issue there is that the internet, rather than being a discrete thing, has sort of become everything in a way.
Yeah.
And given that Ofcom already regulated some of the video sharing platforms anyway, and in some ways we have a growing convergence between broadcasting and streaming anyway, for it to be a single regulator that would work with those companies across those different services seemed to make sense. Ofcom didn't think it was too big an area of responsibility. I wonder, I've wondered in the past whether at some point we should split Ofcom between, if you like, the content regulation side and the pipes regulation side. So the side of Ofcom that regulates the price or wholesale price of broadband, and the post office, should that be something separate from the regulator that is effectively overseeing what's distributed through those networks rather than just the price of the access to them? But I think on the whole, in some ways giving Ofcom as a single regulator all the extra resources it's been given to do this was probably the right step, and setting up yet another regulator would have probably added more time and complexity to the process.
You led, a valiant campaign to catch up with what I think most of us hadn't spotted really until perhaps the tens, what all this meant. And certainly 2016 was the year when it all became clear. Having played catch up and now got the bill on the statute books and coming into force, without artificial intelligence as the sort of next and exponentially perhaps bigger technological leap, what are your sort of lessons to regulators or prospective regulators and legislators now in order to kind of, as it were, vaccinate the system in advance? How can regulators and politicians and people in public square think about this before it becomes a kind of catch-up campaign?
Sure. I'm not sure vaccinating the system is the phrase I would have used, but I know what you mean.
Sorry, that was probably the wrong metaphor. But you know what I mean, immunise, to kind of get, what do we need to put in place in terms of a skeletal regulatory structure so that we won't in 10 years' time discover that the thing is out of control?
So I think so what are the principles that underpin what we've tried to do so far? It's that the law applies online as it applies offline as well.
Yeah.
And that people that build systems have a responsibility for how they work, and they should be held to account for them. In some ways, with the Online Safety Act, we're already regulating AI. The bit that is novel and complex and it creates new challenges for us are principally recommendation-driven social media platforms. The thing the most important thing we're looking to regulate through the Online Safety Act are the feeds. Sort of 70% of what people watch on YouTube, they don't search for, it's selected for them by the platform. If you go on TikTok, TikTok is a data-driven platform where it is showing you content it's selected for you to see. When you go on Instagram to search, before you can type anything in, it shows you a whole page of tiles of things you're probably looking for, but you haven't yet decided to search for. The experience of social media has become, I think, a lot less about creating and sharing and much more about consuming. That's what people spend their time doing. So to that extent, we're already regulating AI systems. As the role of AI expands exponentially, I think it's how do we build in those systems of responsibility? I think looking at the most recent developments on AI, particularly with the breakthroughs in China, where if we're going to say new AI systems are going to be more open source, more open to the world for people to build and develop, the price of access is going to be lower than was expected. What you can't do probably is have a model where we say this is about the discrete regulation of 3 or 4 massive companies. So therefore, I think we've got to have something more principles based that says, here's what we think good practice looks like. Here are areas where there are safety concerns. But whatever you develop, you've got to expect that the law will be enforced online. And if we think you are doing something which is, you're creating a recruitment tool which excludes all women,
yes.
Or you're creating a facial recognition technology
Correct.
that excludes all people of colour from a restaurant.
Right.
You are doing things that wouldn't be allowed in law elsewhere. They're clearly discriminatory and not allowed. If you're doing something that facilitates, criminal actions against an individual or a group of individuals, if you're, a pertinent point now, if you're creating systems that are willfully scraping data in breach of copyright and IP law for your own commercial gain, then you should expect to be investigated for that. You should expect there will be sanctions that can be applied on you. And therefore, to do that, we need a statutory underpinning of the regulation of AI.
On a sunset basis, presumably, where every year you go back and look and see what's changed, what you need to change. Yeah?
Or it could be like competition law works at the moment, which is that we have competition, there's guidance on what.
Yes.
But ultimately, if the regulator has got good reason to believe there is a problem, they have the power of the law to go into a company and investigate that. And I don't think what you can do is you can classify risk by amount of spend or amount of compute power, because I think we're increasingly seeing that those things are not the guiders we thought they would be. I don't think you can define risk purely by categories of action, and you might find some technologies which are low risk in one application and high risk in another. Going back to social media recommendation tools are a good example of that. A recommendation tool that will recommend to you a new Taylor Swift track you've not heard is benign. One that's recommending self-harm content. One that one that's recommending self-harm content or terrorist content is clearly very dangerous. But it's the same technology. So I think it's about saying we have to have standards that we set. We have to have good safety standards and guidance that we give. We have to let developers get on with developing. Otherwise, there will be we'll either have guidance that is not worth having, or a system that's so slow nothing ever gets done. But what we have to have, I think, is someone that sits behind that, who's got a lever they can pull and says, okay, if we've got good grounds to believe there is bad activity going on, there is illegality taking place within an organisation, this technology is being used for bad purposes, that we can step in and do something about it, and we're not left in a position where we're basically saying, well, there's nothing we can do.
Just before we take a quick break, what is the big something we can do? What are the sanctions? How can we hit these companies so that they feel it?
Well, go back to the Online Safety Act, you have things like, you have director liability. So if they don't cooperate with the regulator, a named director can go to prison. You have very big fines for clear breaches and persistent breaches. We also have a system of guidance as well. We could set up systems where companies can come and actively seek guidance if they want, or if they're doing something which I think is on the margins. But what I don't think we can have is a free-for-all, where we basically say, we've got to let this rip, it's too complicated to regulate, and people can basically build whatever they want with no accountability or responsibility for it. They can make as much money from it as they want, but they can never be held liable for what they've created. Right. And to do that, you need, whether it's like the Competition and Markets Authority does in competition, or Ofcom will do with online safety, you need accountability and transparency built into the system for when we need it.
Great. Okay, well, let's take a very quick break, and then let's come back and talk about the current travails of the Conservative Party. So, Damian, just to start with, you back Liz Truss, you back Kemi Badenoch, you were born in...
a few other people.
You're born in Nottingham and you support Man United. Northampton, sorry, and you support Man United. Do you ever question your life choices?
Not at all, no. I was born in Northampton, but I grew up in Herefordshire, and when I was a group of us at school decided to join the Man United Supporters Club in Hereford, which was... and Hereford was actually, I suppose we were the nearest Division 1 clubs that would have been in this in the late 80s. Yeah, would have been probably the sort of Aston Villa, West Brom club.
Yeah, it's in a sticky zone.
Manchester wasn't that much further. And I think it's a sort of world of football which is in the top division, which is gone, where you could, you pay a modest fee to be a junior member of a club. You could turn up on match day. Yeah. I turn up at 2:30 and queue outside the Stretford End and paid to stand and watch Manchester United play Liverpool, and that was quite a fun thing to do.
in those days, it wouldn't have been that much fun for a Man United fan.
It was no. I mean, it was a pretty. So I can't speak as being a glory hunter in those days. It was the kind of.
Fair enough.
I remember one year being there for the last home game before Christmas, and there was a message from the board, pre-recorded message from the board that was read out by Bobby Charlton, and it was booed.
Well, let's get back to politics. Kemi, you did support Kemi Badenoch. You didn't have to. You came out.
Yeah.
You were an ex-MP, and you said Kemi's the woman for the Conservative Party. How do you think she's doing?
I think she is someone who people are interested in what she has to say, and that is the first, I think, challenge for any leader of the opposition is: are people interested in what you have to say? Can you command the respect of your colleagues to do that? And then can you build a team and a policy agenda to do that? So I think she's made a good start, but I think she's also been sensible in saying we need a proper process of policy development. We need to think about what we want to say and produce a program of ideas which are based on some proper analysis and thought, and signal to the country that we're looking to rethink what we did. And I think that is right. I mean, I think I'm not in Parliament at the moment, so I like you, I watch it from the outside, with keen interest. And I think that's the challenge we've got now is to, I think, not just to critique this government. I think the public have been pretty quick to identify the issues with the government they're not happy with. The challenge is to what extent does Labour's unpopularity lead to the Conservative Party being seen as the alternative government? And that's the challenge that we have now, is how can you build that up?
Given the conversation we've just had, and you hear Kemi Badenoch on Laura Koonsberg talking about anecdotes and emotions are just as important as facts and analysis. Doesn't that worry you, that actually there's a looseness to the way she's acting that is counter to the kind of rigorous progress you want to see enacted in policy and in law?
No, but I think she is quite an analytical person, so I think that does drive her. But just my personal view on the sort of policy landscape. I think what you have to do when a party comes out of opposition is say, okay, regardless of how good a job we think we might have done, if we were starting with a blank sheet of paper now, what will we do? What's our analysis of the problems that we face?
Right.
And it's true. We are as a country, we have low levels of growth. We have high levels of tax. We have high levels of government borrowing, high levels of debt. I think we've got public services, particularly in the case of the health service, where despite the record amounts that are being spent on them, people's interaction with those services and the level of service they get is way below what they would want. We have to do and I think if we talk about wanting to build an enterprise economy and back people that are hardworking and want to get on, then we have to seriously question whether the tax system is doing that or not. If we want to see growth in the economy, we're going to say, is that just going to come from a few government big projects, or is that actually about empowering people who are out working every day, growing their own businesses, doing what they want to do? Now, you can identify that landscape of policy areas and challenges for the country. And I go on with a list of other things that I think are really important. What no opposition can do is say, okay, now here is the 500-page manifesto that tells you exactly how we're going to deliver that. Yeah. What you can set out is these are the things that we think we need to do, the principles we need to follow. And that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to build a program based on those principles, but get the analysis right of the things that you think need to be done, where the challenges need to come.
Well, let's accept your premise that there's a sort of argument within conservatism that's needed. And I know that's Kemi's premise as well. Okay, let's accept that. What strikes me as sort of odd is if you take the period that you were in Parliament, I mean, for most of that period, the centre ground Tory, the One Nation Tory, was quite an important person, quite an important force in the party, diminishingly so. Now I struggle to think of any senior Conservative in Parliament who really is making the case for what you might call the One Nation Tory position. Not just on Europe, I mean many aspects, but if we're going to have a debate on taxation, technology, the scale of the strategic state, internationalism, climate change, all these big things, you'd want, wouldn't you, as broad a debate as possible. And what concerns me a bit is that I see sort of varieties of right-wingery, that are more or less populist, that are more or less committed to the culture war. When Tom Tugendhat in the leadership challenge said, "Oh, we might have to get out of the European Convention on Human Rights," I thought, well, that's a step. That when someone like him is starting to talk about that, where is that old? I mean, or am I just asking the wrong question? Has that old centrism in the Tory party just gone?
No, I mean, I think obviously in terms of personnel, you've got a lot smaller parliamentary party. So I think it's still a parliamentary party that reflects the different traditions, if you like, of the Conservative Party. But if you'd say what's the kind of essence of One Nation conservatism, which is to say there is, sometimes there is a role for the state to step in, because there are problems in society that are so great that maybe actually government policy is part of the problem, and that therefore government action needs to change. But also, if government doesn't step in, no one else will. The market is not a problem the market thinks is an important priority to fix, and therefore we've got to do something about it. So does that spirit still exist in the Conservative Party? Absolutely, it does. The question is how will that now be applied?
Where do I find it?
Well, I think I could list.
Tell me to go.
No, but I think there are, and I think the debates we'll have about how can we make service delivery in the NHS better? You'll see it there. How can we make energy markets and the planning system more responsive to people's needs? I think taking an in principle step on taxation. I thought James Cleverly made a good point during the leadership campaign of saying basically, should we say as a point of principle, no one should ever have to pay more than half of a pound that they earn in tax. Sort of as a point of principle to say not just about what should tax rates be, but in principle, what should be the balance between the working person and the amount they have to pay in tax.
But we're not in the 80s anymore, are we? I mean, if you look at what made Thatcher so unique was that she understood owning the future being the essence of power. Now, the future now, in 2025, is going to involve a lot of statecraft, maybe maximally or minimally, but it is. So isn't the first question, okay, what bits are we going to have to have an answer to in terms of statesmanship, statecraft? Is climate change something that government has to do more on? So is social care really going to be soluble without quite big government intervention? Now, I'm not prejudging the answers to this, but all I'm saying is that if the first thing after that trouncing the election that the Conservatives say is we're going to keep taxes down, are they getting the memo?
Not if that's the only message. No, I think just to say we believe in a small state and we believe in low taxes. I think when
we know how that movie ends.
I know. Well, also we presided over a government where taxes went up and spending went up and borrowing went up.
In some cases with good. I mean, over COVID with good reason.
With good reason. It wasn't recklessness. It was kind of necessity that those things happened. I think what Mrs. Thatcher was good at doing was also identifying that the zeitgeist of the country had changed in the 70s, in reaction to the sort of chaos that had ensued. That government after government, Labour and Conservative, that had spent more than it could afford, that had made promises it could keep, that had been too soft on the unions, and that actually people wanted something different. Working people didn't like the idea of having to join a trade union. Or not being able to work in a place. There were people didn't like the idea of being forced out on strike on the whim of a union leader, or being forced out on strike because of a strike in a different industry. Because it was considered by their union that they were sympathetic to it. People wanted real reform. Working people on modest incomes wanted to be able to buy their council house because that was the clear way they could get on the housing ladder. There are lots of sensible, experienced Labour politicians opposed all of these things, and what the Conservatives were good at doing was identifying the public mood had changed.
Well, just let me say, because I should say it, that when you say the public mood, massive swathes of the public mood were fiercely against all of those things, to the point where they revolted, literally, and the council tax, the riots, and social unrest across the country due to Thatcher's not recognition of a zeitgeist, but the way that she was pulling the country one way, and it was being resisted fiercely by big swathes of the country.
By some, but also you look at the seats Margaret Thatcher won. There are plenty of places in the north of England, some big cities in the north of England that had Conservative members of Parliament at that time that haven't done since. And so there was it's not true to say that there were whole the north of England revolted against.
No, I didn't say that. But big pockets of the community.
Of course, there were. It was controversial, But nevertheless, what she demonstrated was there was a support for it. That the mood had changed. I think what the Conservative Party has to do now, is seeking to come back to government, is not just reflect on its own principles, but say, to what extent may public opinion have shifted? So in the way we deliver health and social care, have people's attitudes towards that change, not to the extent that they want, where they say actually building capacity in the system is now the number one challenge. So what we want to see is solutions that build in more capacity, maybe with greater involvement for the private sector, but still with the NHS, which is free at the point of access and delivered universally. And actually that is where we want to see the new thinking coming. And I think that's what the party has to do now, is to identify those things. I think there are some strategic things like I think expanding energy production is going to be hugely important. We talked about tech.
Yes.
Tech, if you want to see if the future is about big data centers serving these massive tech companies, what you need to support that is water and electricity. Because you need the electricity to power these systems and the water to cool them down. And we're going to need to see big strategic increases in our supply for those industries of the future. And having a clear map that says this is what's important. Planning reform, I think, something is important too. I saw in my time in Parliament too many occasions where you'd have a major planning application which will be timed out because of constant back and forth and constant appeals and referring to the judicial system to second guess every decision the council has made on every major application, and done so by campaigners who know that you can exhaust the process and therefore nothing gets done. And we've got to reflect on whether actually we need to have more civic leadership. We need to empower local authorities to make some of these decisions. Of course, the planning inspector can be there for egregious errors on their behalf, but on the whole, we let people get on and make decisions.
One of the problems, it seems to me, is that there's a terrible gravitational pull here of reform, which is, and the risk for the Conservative Party that it ends up just being reform light. Whereas an alternative is to say, in words to the effect of, we acknowledge from the 2024 defeat that the period 2016 to 24 was very difficult. Some of those were due to exogenous things like COVID and Ukraine, but not all of them. And we're now going to focus squarely on the future. This is going to be a future-facing Conservative Party. And we think that the big problem that unites all of the grievances and issues and aspirations that people have now across generations, across communities, is that they want a fair shake.
Yes.
They want a fair shake. They feel that that career structures, opportunities, things that were taken for granted in previous generations are crumbling before their eyes for all sorts of reasons. And the Conservative Party could rebuild itself as the party of the fair shake and say, those guys over the Labour Party are hopelessly technocratic. They talk about missions and milestones and growth, full stop, and it doesn't add up to a row of beans. We're the party of the fair shake. Now, in order to do that, though, you have to, A, uncouple yourself from the Brexit past, whatever you do about Europe in the future, and B, you have to say we're not Farage.
Yes. Well, I think what the best way to not be Farage is to have a broad manifesto of ideas which resonate with people, because that's not what he's offering. He's offering a one-trick pony solution, and without much thinking. And I think if we don't have if you're saying, well, actually, there are a series of reasons why I'm going to vote Conservative, because they're the only people that have got serious ideas on things I think will actually change this country for the better, and therefore it's worth getting behind those ideas to deliver them. This can make a meaningful difference to my life. The amount of money I have left at the end of the month, the things I can do with my family as a consequence of that, the thing that makes me feel like going to work in the morning is worth doing.
And making things work.
Exactly. So that's why I think, the way people access public services, the quality of those services, the speed of response, the capacity within those systems, I think people want to see a lot more of it. It does, going back to tax, one of those things is I think a lot of middle income earners in this country are taxed increasingly heavily. The very wealthy can always take care of their own affairs. We prioritise in government lifting the lowest earners out of tax altogether. I think it is, working families who, I think if you're earning £50,000-60,000 a year as a work, you're not rich by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at the threshold for the higher rate of income tax, I asked the House of Commons Library this. If it had kept pace with where Nigel Lawson set it in 1988, what would it be now? And you're looking more like high 70s, £80,000 a year, that sort of figure. Yeah. Before in the old days, you'd have started paying, equivalently the high rate of income tax. And I think and if you look at the people in this country, who are the people whose spending drives the economy, whose aspiration drives the economy and society? It's a lot of those middle income people, and I think they're the ones I think that have borne the heaviest burden for the COVID crisis and bailing out the bankers, and continue to do so. So that does mean you've got to make decisions. Because
what about, all right, here's one. Be Nixon in China. Be the party that says we can't tax income anymore. We're going to tax assets. We're going to tax wealth.
Yeah.
So that would electrify the landscape. Now, a lot of your members would hate it.
Yeah. But so this takes you into so if you look at like taxes on capital, on businesses, farms, some ways what we designed was we built a system where what we say to entrepreneurs or family farm owners was what we want you to do. We don't want you just to sell your asset and go off. We want you to keep on investing in it because you've created this thing. It creates a lot of benefit for other people, and we want it to grow and succeed. So we want to create incentives for you to carry on investing and working in the business that you've created, which is good for society, rather than just selling it and going off to Monte Carlo with all your money. And I think that's really important too. So there is a balance between them. But what it does do, unless we see, magic growth, which has to be the solution to everyone's problems, it does mean you've got to make decisions over tax and spend. If we're saying we think, smaller business people, middle income earners are being charged too heavily, there are disincentives there for them to work, we've got to find that money elsewhere. That's going to mean less borrowing, less spending, maybe an honest debate about are there some things, has government's intervention in certain areas gone too far to extent it's not sustainable and affordable? We need to rethink that. That's got to be part of the package. I think one of the problems Labour's created for itself now is it could have used this election to be honest about that, at the time of the election, and say, look, we can't do everything in one go. There are some things we're going to prioritise, which we think are about achieving the growth we need to do what we want in the future. But what we've trapped ourselves into at the moment is, politicians being trapped into promising, to do everything and not being able to do anything as a consequence.
But there's an audacity gap at the moment that the Conservatives could fill if they, and I don't just mean by culture war slogans, I mean by saying, this lot, the Labour government, they're not offering you anything other than technocracy. We have the courage to say this is going to involve a complete rewiring of our assumptions on fiscal policy, on the role of the state and everything, and it's going to be tough, but this will work.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, that is absolutely right, and it's giving people a very clear sense of what you want to do. That you don't just want to be in government because you think you're better at it than the other lot.
Yes,
but they've got a very clear sense of what you would do. And I think regardless of what people think of Donald Trump, I think it's something he is quite effective at. You could probably, people in America could probably reel off 3 or 4 things Donald Trump would do as president. Now, whether you agree with them or not is another.
Well, he's done about
matter.
150 since he came in.
You've got an idea of what, and so we've got to give people a very clear sense of that. And of course, as you know, the challenge when you're in opposition is, people don't follow what you do every day. No. They're quite happy leaving you in the box they put you in at the last election and see no reason to open that box again. So you've got to fight your way out of that box with ideas that engage people. So people say, I want to see that happen, and therefore I've got to vote for that party to make it happen. Now, we could probably spend the next hour talking about what those things could be, and I think that's why it's not surprising that Kemi wants a kind of some sort of proper process so it's not just her gut feel on any particular day. It's a proper process of identifying that, but we've got to get going on telling that story.
Do you think we'll ever have an honest conversation about the problems that Brexit has created? You voted Remain. After the referendum, you said it's my duty to see through the democratic result of that referendum. At what point does that wear off? I know these are old, time-worn conversations, but I think a lot of our listeners are sitting there thinking there's one thing that could change materially the fortunes of this country in terms of economic growth. Putting aside the arguments around the referendum, it would be some real meaningful, closer relationship with Europe. At what point does somebody grasp that nettle and say, enough of this bollocks, we've got to re-engage with the single market or a customs union and crack on, because that's where our fortunes lie?
Yeah, but anecdotally, a member of Parliament of Folkestone and Hythe, I had the Channel Tunnel in my constituency. Before the referendum, 90% of the fish caught in Folkestone Harbour were sold at the fish market in Boulogne. Now virtually none are. So they're sold at Brixham, wholesale markets there and elsewhere. But so there's been a change to trade. You don't see as many British lorries queuing up to cross to the continent. You largely see European lorries returning back to Europe. So there's no doubt it's had an impact on the way we trade and do business. I would like us to have a better trading relationship with Europe than we do now. The question is, what could that be like? What deal is realistically on offer from Europe? I think that has been a problem, that the EU has a very fixed sense of how it wants to work with other people and work with the UK. That rigidity, I don't think, has necessarily served it well. And I think looking at the internal political problems within the EU at the moment, you see there is a questioning of the leadership of Europe from the people of Europe, and certainly for us, as far as the Europeans are concerned, there's no question of us going back in on the terms of our own old membership.
Yeah.
We'd be treated as a new member accession state, as if we'd never been a member.
Yeah.
We'd be required to commit to join the euro, and so there are a series of hurdles that have been put in place by them. There are lots of things you could easily do now to make trade.
Well, you say put in place
easier.
by them, but I mean, none of those hurdles would exist if we hadn't decided to leave.
Of course, but in terms of saying things could be easier, now the EU is still determined to demonstrate that to any member state that would leave, that leaving is a bad idea.
But if you were Prime Minister, Damian, right now, and you were faced with the sort of olive branches that Keir Starmer's been offered around youth mobility, for instance, would you? If you had that offer of youth mobility conversations and you're Prime Minister, would you say, OK, we'll take that as a route towards a closer integration?
Well, as a route towards a better relationship, I think I would look at what are the areas where actually we'll put to one side the question of the UK ever rejoining the EU, which I cannot foresee at the moment at all. I don't think that's a decision that the country would make, and I don't think it's a realistic opportunity is on offer anyway. Where are the areas where we could improve our relationship? Where we can still, as an independent country, make a sensible decision that benefits us and we think is in there and is good for them too. Where are the areas of cooperation where actually as a non-member state we can still cooperate as well? I would say, border security at the EU perimeter, particularly in the Mediterranean, where actually it's in our interest too, because the people that are coming over in dinghies, to Kent from northern France, didn't start their journey there, and we could help and support, policing in the Mediterranean and elsewhere to deal with migrant gangs. Let's look at areas where actually UK participation and cooperation is helpful to Europe, and good, and in our interest too, and let's work on improving those relationships. Let's even at a technical level where we have legislation that is different, like tech regulation, which is slightly different but quite similar. Let's have a good sort of just dialogue at a technical level about the things we're trying to do, and let's look at where we can learn from each other about things that are working.
So, do you think Keir Starmer's doing a fairly good job then, in that regard?
Well, I mean, I don't know what he's discussing with them behind closed doors, but I think if you ask Boris Johnson, he would say he tried to do the same thing. To say, we want a successful relationship. We've got ideas about how that relationship could work. We want to talk to you about it. I do think though that, I think that one of the things that we don't talk about as much in the UK is that we underestimate, I think, how much people in Europe, particularly in the European institutions, were hurt by the process. And in some ways the negotiations made it look like they were very tough and sort of stick waving, and we tried to fight our corner. But there was a lot of hurt about the breakdown of the relationship that will take time to heal. And I think part of trying to heal that process is saying that, if we were looking at it cold to say, this is a massively important trading bloc right on our doorstep, made up of members that are largely our friends and allies. We may not be a member of that club anymore, but what we want to be is, if not a member, a good neighbour with a strong relationship that is successful and where there's trust on both sides. And that is going to take, I think, a concerted effort to rebuild. At
the risk of jeopardising a relationship with the United States?
I don't think those two things should never be in conflict.
But they will be, won't they, with Trump?
Well, we survive. I think, there are different presidents, different prime ministers. The long-term relationship endures. Mm-hmm. The strategic relationship between the United States, the UK and the European Union is very important. NATO underpins that from a security point of view, and that's got to continue. Now, we may see on trade, for example, and tariffs, where we're in a position, along with the Canadians and maybe other countries too, where we're actually united and saying to the Americans, well, we think you've got this wrong, and we want to talk you down from what you're doing because we don't think it's the right way of going about this. And we should be prepared to do that, to be honest with, as candid friends with both parties.
Let's take a very quick break and come back and talk about something much less contentious and more enjoyable than today's politics. We'll talk about two giants from the past, Lloyd George and Teddy Roosevelt.
Let's do that.
Welcome back, dear listeners. We're here with Damian Collins, who is a politician, but also an author. And your book at the moment is
Universal Man.
Renaissance Man is David Lloyd George. Tell
Rivals in the Storm. Excellent
Rivals
book.
in the Storm.
Buy it, folks. It's very good.
Tell the folks about why you're so obsessed with David Lloyd George.
Well, I think he invented the modern job of being Prime Minister. He did it without any rule book about what to do, and he did it during a world war. And I think the process of how someone who was an outsider, brought up in a small village in North Wales where English was his second language, how he came to be the first minister of Great Britain and its empire at a period of incredible danger to its survival, in a war which we could easily have lost. I think that's not something we get taught in school particularly, but I think we could easily have lost it. And it required a supreme effort from him to transform the state, organise for modern warfare, and win the war. And he did that, with a track record of, thinking about how the government could deliver social programs for reform. It really laid the foundations of the modern welfare state. He was, I think, a hugely influential figure in the development of politicians like Winston Churchill, and someone I think, is a hugely significant person in our political history in the 20th century. But in some ways, whose story has been so overshadowed by Winston Churchill's that we'd lost sight of him, and that he'd become this sort of pantomime figure of, as far as people knew of him, the philanderer and seller of honours. But he was a much more complex and substantial figure, and I thought was worthy of another look.
And like Churchill, was Prime Minister without being leader of a party, which is almost unthinkable now, isn't it? Well, it is unthinkable now.
Well, that's right. And in some ways, they say that you should write about people that have done things no one else has done, as a test. And that I think is, I think there's only 3 times that's happened where a Prime Minister's not been leader of a party. Once during the Crimean War, which is a very long time ago. So I think the example of Lloyd George and Churchill, is prescient. And the reason I called the book Rivals in the Storm is that Lloyd George is made Prime Minister not by his friends but by his enemies. It's the Conservatives who he has bullied and ridiculed and poked fun at for years, who end up deciding he's the person that has to become the Prime Minister. They see a crucial point in the First World War where they think Herbert Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, has not got a grip of affairs. We will lose the war unless there's a more rigorous prosecution of that war. And they decide the person to do that is the Liberal Lloyd George. And so how that came about, that these people who were his enemies ended up making him Prime Minister, in the process of throwing over a lot of his old friends, how they then went about winning the war, and then how those relationships broke down in the years that followed. And I think that's a sort of fascinating political story. And I think for the Liberals too, Churchill was reconciled to the Conservative Party in the end through winning the war.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party decided that qualified him to be leader of the Conservative Party, where the Liberals never reconciled themselves as a bloc to what they saw as Lloyd George's defenestration of Herbert Asquith, and remained hopelessly split and never formed a government again.
What is it in the names we're just tossing around now? Asquith, Lloyd George, Churchill. These are
titans.
They are titans.
Yes.
Now, the names you could toss around with today's politics, Starmer, Badenoch, Davey, they don't quite have the same ring of greatness about them. Or am I just being historically unfair?
Well, sometimes you need history to judge.
Do you think 60 or 70 years someone will be having a podcast about
Nadine Dorries?
About Nadine.
They may well do.
Stranger things about
it might not be a political podcast, but
I'm sure if you were back in the 1920s, people would have been saying, it's not like the titans of Gladstone and Disraeli, who would
those are the days,
who would have been in recent living memory. Lloyd George was in Parliament to see Gladstone speak and regarded him as the greatest parliamentarian. I have in the book I have a note of a dinner where Arthur Balfour is kind of recounting great parliamentary speakers of his career, where he's comparing Lloyd George and Asquith to Gladstone and Disraeli. So I think it's always the things things aren't what they were, and they never were what they were.
Well, according to T.S. Eliot, that generation were the hollow men.
Yeah.
So, it proves the point, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Or, Michael Foot's the guilty men to talk about
yes.
Bourbon and Chamberlain. So I think, but also circumstances. I think what we see consistently throughout history and in life is that you see this in Ukraine now, is that terrible things happen, and in a crisis, some people step up to that crisis in a way that people didn't expect and show capacities and a resilience that people didn't know that they had. You know, and are prepared to take the difficult decisions.
Because absolutely no one knew, I think in Ukraine included, that Zelensky was going to turn into Zelensky, if that makes any sense.
Quite. I mean, how would you have predicted it?
He was not popular.
No.
But he suddenly became this great war leader.
And if you think with Lloyd George, someone whose career was in local politics in Wales, becomes an MP. He's, for the first 10 years of his career, he makes his name on, Welsh church reform and educational reform in Wales and church schools. He then becomes a national figure by speaking out openly against the Boer War. So the idea that someone like that was seen as a hugely divisive figure within the Liberal Party and within the country, because at the high point of what was seen as a patriotic Union Jack flag waving war, the khaki election called on the back of it being won, spoke out against it and won an audience and a name for himself in doing so. The idea of 1902, you just said that person, he will not only unite the country, but he will be a supreme war leader and lead us in a war that's scale and complexity we cannot yet understand, but will be the person that is arguably most responsible for leading us to victory. You never would have predicted that. And if you'd come back in a time machine and said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, people would have thought you were, so even if that scenario is correct, I can't believe Lloyd George will be the man that will do those things.
A mate of Lloyd George's, if I can be that casual, is Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
Who is another hero of yours.
Yes.
And of mine. I actually called my first son Theodore, and then we lived near Arsenal, and 6 months later Arsenal signed Theo Walcott. So if you walk down Upper Street in Islington now and shout Theo, about 12 kids turn round. But my Theo is named after Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
And what I loved about him was not necessarily his politics, but the way he carried himself, and his stature and his sense of ambition. And do you think there's something missing in politics these days where the great characters are no longer politicians, or the great ambitions don't come from politics, they come from somewhere else? And the other thing I want to ask you about Theodore Roosevelt today is it seems almost the antithesis of Trump and his attitude towards third-party power. I mean, Roosevelt was the great breaker up of third-party power.
Yes.
Whereas Trump seems to give it succor and sees it as part of the whole.
Yes.
What is it about those dynamics?
Wow, I mean, God, that's a book in its own right, I think. I think, if you like dinners in history you'd like to have been at, one I think I would like to have been at was at Brooks's Club in 1910, when after the funeral of Edward VII, I think it was William Haldane hosted dinner, and this is where Lloyd George meets Theodore Roosevelt for the first time, and they both were aware of each other. They had a mutual friend in the form of Arthur Lee, now famous as the man who gave checkers to the nation, but he befriended Roosevelt earlier in his career and was a friend and helper of Lloyd George's. They're both progressives in the age of the great progressive movement, but I mean, Roosevelt a progressive conservative and Lloyd George a progressive liberal. I think in both cases politics was within them, and I think in both cases their sense of who they were and their political mission was formed quite early. So I think Lloyd George is always influenced by the chapel. The sense of that there are standing up for the people in society that are not strong enough to stand up for themselves. That there are people who are victims in society, not because they've done anything wrong, but because of circumstance, and therefore there's a duty to protect them, like the Good Samaritan, to sort of step in. And I think Theodore Roosevelt had a different mission, but born out of the experience of his father, who was a victim of, as he saw it, the corrupt sort of Tammany Hall politics of New York in the 19th century, and at an early age, against his family's advice and wishes, Theodore Roosevelt throws himself into politics. And a consistent path through that politics is taking on corrupt interests. For people that watch the TV series The Gilded Age, this is a theme. The barons like Jay Gould, were seen as people who bought off politicians. They did it to further their own commercial interests. Political donations to buy victories.
Robber barons.
For state parties. These party bosses that controlled the nominations for preferred office, and Roosevelt always fought against that, and it got him into a lot of trouble. And he only became president by accident.
Yes.
I mean, I love the story. He became president because he was vice president, and the then president was assassinated, William McKinley, a state fair.
Great favourite of Trump's.
Indeed, and Mount McKinley we now have by executive order of President Trump. But he only became vice president because the party boss in New York State wanted to get rid of him as governor of New York State.
Yeah.
He didn't like the way he was meddling in these business interests, and he was causing problems. And so a deal was done to bump him up to the vice presidency in the hope that McKinley would live another 4 years, and then Roosevelt they'd make sure he never got the nomination. And even the day after McKinley, when Roosevelt gets to Buffalo, swears the oath of office, just after McKinley has died, he's Mark Hanna, who was the great party boss that had made McKinley president, was McKinley's great friend. He turns to Roosevelt and says, "Don't even think about a second term." So from the party establishment is completely against him. And then what he doesn't do then is he doesn't take it easy. You think, okay, well, if I'm sensible, I'll get. He just goes hell for leather on the program he wants to deliver. Yeah. And I think the reason I got interested in Teddy Roosevelt and the sort of his progressive politics and the antitrust movement is the parallels between the power of big tech today and the power of the steel barons and the oil magnates, the JP Morgans and Rockefellers, is very
who created McKinley.
Yeah, exactly. Who created McKinley? The power of those people is we've not really probably seen that until today when you look at the power of the big tech titans.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, we could talk about
fascinating.
Yeah.
Though both Lloyd George and Roosevelt
do buy
forever.
the book though, listeners. It's a really, really great read. It really is. And although we love to see Damian back in the Commons as soon as possible,
is that an ambition?
I'd like to. Of course, I'd like to go back.
But we hope that the Parliament will last long enough for you to write another book.
I hope so too.
Great stuff.
And
Thank
come
you
back
so
and
much.
tell us how you're getting on.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on. Don't forget to subscribe to The New European, which is what funds all of this great conversation. You go to theneweuropean.co.uk/2mats and you get a free bottle of tequila when you subscribe. Are you a subscriber, Damian?
I'm not, but I obviously have to review that.
Well, you must review that decision to get a free bottle of tequila while
exactly.
stocks last. Send in any feedback and questions to 2mats@tnepublishing.com. That's the number 2, MATTS, at tnepublishing.com. Thanks again to our guest, Damian Collins.
Thank you, Damian. Thank
you to our production team from Rethink Audio, led by the great Matt Hill. And until Thursday,
We'll see you then.
we'll see you then.
Have a great week.
Thank you.